Hello, a very good morning, one and all on the other ends. We have stepped into the third day, fifth session of national level e-conference on contemporary trends in literature, hosted by Department of English, Munger University, Munger. A warm welcome to this penultimate session. I express my gratitude to our Honorable VC Chancellor, sir, Honorable uh, Pro-VC ma'am, our convener sir, Dr. Uh, BC Pandit sir, because they always champion the cause of academic activities. And as you know, in this session, we have got the topic masculinity studies as one of the contemporary trends. In simple term, masculinity is just the counterpart of femininity. Masculinities and femininities are created and recreated throughout the life cycle, confirmed, negotiated, and modified on a daily basis. Different people, different cultures, and different periods of history construct or reconstruct masculinity differently. While we find works on women and femininity evolved into the discourse of feminism, works on men and masculinities are still unable to evolve into a discourse. Rather, they resist being located in a single discourse or under any single rubric or category of ism. Today, we have the benign presence of Professor Niladri Chatterjee, Professor, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. I would like to call upon him. Please, I request admin, please, okay, bring him in focus. Okay, okay, sir. Very good morning. Okay, sir. And thank you, sir, for accepting our proposal and being with us with your benign presence. Uh, Professor Niladri Chatterjee is a person who has been teaching and working extensively in the field of gender studies for almost 3 decades. And he will be talking on masculinity studies. What can be more fruitful than this? Uh, to introduce Professor Niladri Chatterjee is a very enterprising task. Still, I will be very brief in enumerating some of his feats and achievements. Professor Niladri Chatterjee, uh, uh, he had completed his doctoral work on Christopher Isherwood. He is a recipient of Fulbright scholarship, for which he went to University of Texas at Austin, and uh, he is also the associated with the British Council Charles Wallace Fellowship, and for their purpose, he visited University of Cambridge. Professor Chatterjee has co-edited the Muffled Heart Stories of the Disempowered Male and contributed to the American Isherwood and also contributed to Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, published in 2004, the Isherwood Century, and Reader's Companion to 20th Century Writers. So the lists are very long to enumerate. And he was also a member of the editorial board of the American Notes and Queries, in which already he published many uh, articles. He has been teaching a course in gender studies at his university since 2009 and runs a Facebook group called New Gender Studies, which has over 14,000 members. No, I am not making an error. Over 14,000 members. Professor Chatterjee has recently begun contributing to the OER. Uh, with Tutun Mukherjee, he co-edited Narihav, Androgyny and Female Impersonation in India. And above all, in 2016, he published his novel, The Scholar. So if we put aside all the things which I mentioned beforehand, he is better known as a novelist also. So it's my pleasure and privilege that I am introducing Niladri sir. Please, sir, please we are actually awaiting for your lecture. Thank you, sir. Please begin with your lecture, sir. Yes, sir. The platform, the forum, all yours, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you, Atanu, for that very generous introduction. And thank you also to Onindo, who has done such a wonderful job in putting this session together. Thanks also go to the head of the department, who has been at the helm of organizing this rather wonderful seminar. And of course, my thanks to the university, Munger University, for very kindly inviting me to speak today. What I wish to talk about today is masculinity studies. Now, masculinity studies should not be seen, as a lot of people are in the habit of seeing, as being sort of counter to feminism. So I remember when I initially began to teach masculinity studies or to talk about masculinity studies, a lot of men would get very, very happy and they would say, yes, it's time for men to talk about themselves. Yeah. And I was very amused by that, because masculinity studies is not meant to be the counter discourse to feminism. What a lot of men should understand is that masculinity studies is actually essentially feminist. So that is the first thing that I would want to put on record, is that masculinity studies draws its critical apparatus, draws its ability to diagnose the way in which gender works in society. A lot of that is actually inspired by and informed by feminism. So you can actually think of masculinity studies as an extension of feminism, not a protest against it. So that is the first thing that I think I would want to stress. The second thing that I would want to stress is that masculinity studies, because it came to the field quite late, it actually, well, the initial work began to happen sometime in the 1970s, but it isn't until the 1980s or early 2000 that it began to develop as a fully formed discipline. So if you have to look at the way in which masculinity studies has developed, then one can say that it has been developing very rapidly over the last 20 years. Because it is such a late entrant into the field of gender studies, because we, before masculinity studies, we've already had feminism, we've already had queer theory, we had gay and lesbian studies, we have had disability studies. So therefore, because so many of these identitarian political studies have happened before, masculinity studies actually, by coming so late, was in a position of great advantage. And the position of great advantage was that it learned from the mistakes that previous theoretical hermeneutics, previous theoretical formulations in the field of gender studies had committed unconsciously. So previously, there were certain notions regarding sex, regarding gender, regarding sexuality that had been, so there were some misconceptions regarding sex, gender, and sexuality in the early formulations of gender studies. But since the intervention of gay and lesbian studies, since the intervention of queer theory, since the intervention of disability studies, even since the intervention of post-humanism, which of course comes a little later, masculinity studies learned not to make those mistakes. So masculinity studies learned from the mistakes of the theoretical discourses that had gone before and was very cautious not to make those mistakes. That is the second thing. The third thing, and for us, I think a fairly crucial thing that we have to understand, is that masculinity studies, although initially began to assume that it was about men, or about men's bodies, or about cis men. Cis men basically are those who are supposedly born with male genitalia. And the reason why I'm putting male genitalia within quotation marks is because I'll tell you why that it is a problem to regard the penis as male and the vagina as female. So that kind of sexing or gendering of genitalia is something that I'll come to later. But for the time being, let me say that in the early days of gender studies, there was an assumption that women who were assigned sex female at birth were the only fit subjects for feminism. So in the early days of feminism, sort of trans women were not a part of the discourse. Yes. Also, for a very long time, lesbian women were not a part of the discourse. Lesbian women started to become a part of the discourse in the 1970s, not before that. So there is a way in which gender studies developed, assuming that gender was only about cis women. Gender was only about women who were born with a vagina. And masculinity studies very, very quickly moved away from that, because masculinity studies recognized fairly early on that masculinity does not depend on the body that has the penis. So this was a very important ground from which masculinity studies developed its critical theorizing. And although it didn't happen fairly early, but the intervention of the trans body and the extremely productive, extremely generative, extremely powerful intervention of trans studies has informed gender studies in a very radical way. And it has also informed masculinity studies in a very radical way. So therefore, when we talk about masculinity studies, we are not going to assume that this is only going to be about those people who were born with a penis. Right? So let me just sort of put that on the table before I go on to a very brief run through the chronology of masculinity studies and to talk about the way in which masculinity is being theorized currently. Okay. So masculinity studies, the way it began was in the 1970s when R.W. Connell carried out a survey among school children in Australia. And when he was doing the survey, he began to notice that even at a very early age, children were being gendered. So children were already being taught who is a boy, who is a girl, how should a boy behave, how should a girl behave. So these instructions were being given at the level of kindergarten, sort of primary school. And so therefore, that is when they began to understand that there is a way in which gender is taught. Not only, so many of us remember what Simone de Beauvoir said very powerfully. She said, one is not born a woman but becomes one. Well, what masculinity studies basically tries to do is to also say that one is not born a man but becomes one. So therefore, masculinity is something that society teaches a certain kind of body, not all bodies. That is the crucial point. Not all bodies are taught masculinity. Some bodies are taught masculinity. And this is where I would want you to make a note of a book that has been published very recently. You can actually read the reviews right now. So the reviews are being published right now. It is called Female Husbands, and it is by this American academic called Jen Manion, if I'm not mistaken. But the name of the book is Female Husbands, A Trans History, if I'm not mistaken. What is Jen Manion doing in the book? What she is broadly doing is that she is going back into history. She's going back into the 18th century, 1740, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And from the newspapers of 1740 right down to 1990, she is looking at newspaper reports of women who lived as men. So there were these women who were presenting themselves as men, and they also very often took on cis women, that is to say women who are born with a vagina. They took on the cis women as their wife. So there were many households that were already beginning to form in the mid 18th century, where there were two women who were living together, but one woman was living entirely like a husband, hence female husband. So she would be wearing so-called men's clothes. She would be behaving in a manner that the society is accustomed to recognize as masculine. So she would be chewing tobacco, she would be swearing, she would be abusive, and people thought, well, she would be, for example, sitting with her knees apart, and people thought, well, I mean, obviously, this person clearly dresses like a man, swears like a man, chews tobacco like a man, sits like a man. The person has to be a man. So a lot of people actually recognize them as men, and that was not a problem in the 18th century. However, and this is a very important point that Jane Mannion makes, is that this somehow began to change in the 19th century. Because in the 19th century, people were no longer willing to accept somebody as a man just because they said they were a man. They were much more interested in the genitalia with which they were born, right? So then there was this discourse that began to develop in the 19th century, which basically said that if you are born with a vagina, then you cannot claim the identity of man for yourself. If you are born with a penis, you cannot claim the identity of woman for yourself, right? So therefore, there was a certain denial of the trans experience. There was a certain denial of the trans identity that was happening in the 19th century. We have to wait for another 100 years for the trans identity to be recognized as a valid identity, where if you say you're a woman, I accept you as a woman. If you say you're a man, I accept you as a man. But that is something that has to wait for about 100 years. Well, actually more than that, I think. More than that. So what we are looking at, therefore, is how is masculinity constructed? Now, therefore, what was happening in this Australian school was that boys were being taught how to be masculine. Now, why were boys being selected to be masculine? Again, because they were recognized in the society as boys. How were they recognized in society as boys? Well, because when they were born with a penis. And this is where I would want to remind us something that, Judith Butler already wrote about 30 years ago in Gender Trouble in 1990, where she said that not only is gender socially constructed, but sex is also socially constructed. But even 30 years later, there seems to be some kind of an assumption that I still hear it around me, and I find it absolutely extraordinary, that there are still people who are saying that sex is biological and gender is social, 30 years after Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. So, when Judith Butler says that sex is also social, what did she mean? What did she mean by saying sex is also social? This is what she meant. What she said is that when a child is born, yes, and when a certain sex is applied to the child, I have, so-and-so has given birth to a boy, so-and-so has given birth to a girl. When this sex is applied, I have a male child, I have a female child, that application is actually not really based on the genitalia of the child. It is not based on the genitalia of the child. It is based on how the genitalia is read. It is based on how the genitalia is regarded. So when a child is born with a penis, it is assumed that the child will grow up to be a boy, and the child will grow up to be a man, and the child will therefore desire a woman, and therefore the child will need the penis to impregnate the woman. So therefore the child is destined to be a man. Now, this assumption is something that has been at the root of all trouble for a very long time, and we would not have been able to identify the trouble had it not been for the greater visibility, the greater availability of trans narratives, of trans bodies that we have today. So what the trans body does is that it basically challenges the way in which we regard sex. Let me give you an example. I think it was in 2014 that either in Ecuador or in Paraguay, but I think probably Ecuador, a couple became very famous. This was a couple that became very famous because these two people were married to each other. And here is the best part. The husband was expecting their first child. I'm going to say this again. The husband was expecting the couple's first child. So the husband was pregnant. The husband had been impregnated. This is where it gets even more interesting. The husband was impregnated by his wife. So think about it. So we are actually looking at a couple where the husband has the ovaries and the wife has the penis. So if the wife has the penis, then here is the question. Does the penis still remain a male genitalia? It doesn't. It doesn't remain the male genitalia anymore. It becomes the female genitalia if the person possessing that genitalia claims to be a woman. Similarly, if the person carrying the womb, if the person with the uterus and the ovaries and the vagina, if the person says that I am a man, then the person should be recognized as a man. So if man is capable of having either a penis or a vagina, if a woman is capable of having either a penis or a vagina, then neither the penis nor the vagina has any fixed sex. It doesn't have a fixed sex. So therefore, those of us who automatically associate the penis with the male, they should then ask themselves that if the penis is always already male, then how do you read the penis on the body of a person who claims to be a woman? Right? So therefore, the very simple proposition with which we need to continue is that the penis is not a male sexual or excretory organ. It can be a male organ, but it can be a female organ. So therefore, the penis does not have any fixed sex. So if the penis does not have any fixed sex, then Judith Butler goes on to say, then therefore one can very simply say that the penis does not have sex. The penis does not have sex. It is simply an organ which produces, out of which urine comes out of which sperm comes out, but that sperm can come out of the body of somebody who claims to be female, just as the ovaries can be contained in somebody who claims to be male. So therefore, if we are going to dissociate the supposedly cis male body from masculinity, then it becomes much easier to understand exactly how masculinity is formed. So then how is masculinity formed? Well, this is how. Masculinity is formed as a very rigorous exercise that is repeated over and over again. So it is an exercise that is repetitive, like most exercises. It is an exercise which seeks to consolidate a certain kind of presentation, physical presentation, gender presentation, which is going to be recognized as masculine. So that, I think, is what we really need to understand. So then, masculinity does not remain anything that is fixed to a certain kind of body. Masculinity therefore becomes, this is where I'm going to use the term that was popularized by Jacques Derrida when he was talking about deconstruction. Masculinity then becomes a floating signifier. It becomes a floating signifier because it can be seen or it can be performed by any kind of body. It does not have to be the body that has got a penis attached to it. It can be any kind of body. So then masculinity becomes a movable construction, right? It becomes a movable construction. It can be set down on any ground. Think of masculinity as a kind of a circus tent. Think of the masculinity as a circus tent. So a circus tent can be put down on any ground, anywhere. Yes? So similarly, masculinity is like a circus tent. It can be put down on anybody, anywhere. It does not have to have a penis to perform masculinity. Now, having said that, but this is something which has begun to be recognized after the work of 2 or 3 extremely important trans theorists. I am going to mention Jack Halberstam for his wonderful book, Female Masculinity, and I'm also going to mention Jean Bobby Noble for his wonderful work in the area of masculinity studies. Masculinity Without Men, I think it's called. But before Jack Halberstam and Jean Bobby Noble, there was, of course, R.W. Connell, who essentially started his life as R.W. Connell, Robert Connell, but has now gender transitioned and is now a woman called Raven Connell. So R.W. Connell used to be a man, but is now a woman. Right, and I think that this particular transition that he has gone, that she has gone through, is very, very important for us to keep in mind, because it will help us understand how gender is not fixed, how sex is not fixed. Yes, so therefore masculinity should be recognized as a kind of gender presentation, nothing more than that, nothing more than that. It is a gender presentation which is constantly mutating, which is constantly moving, which is constantly changing, which is constantly evolving. And that is what we really need to keep in mind. Now, that is as far as the base is concerned. But let us look at the way in which those people who are born with a penis, how do they normally perform masculinity? Bodies with the penis. How do they perform masculinity? Now, this is where R.W. Connell and William Messerschmitt, they came up with a 3-tier analysis of masculinity. So on top was hegemonic masculinity. then you had complicit masculinity, then you had subordinate masculinity. So this is a three-tier masculinity that was being done. Hegemonic masculinity. Well, those who perform hegemonic masculinity, there are very few, by the way. There are very few people in any society who perform hegemonic masculinity. But those few people that do, what is hegemonic masculinity? It is simply the kind of masculinity that is valorized at that point in that particular society. Yes. So therefore, it is a kind of masculinity that is valorized at that point in that particular society. So you can therefore say that today in India, hegemonic masculinity is the kind that is being celebrated by a film like Kabir Singh. Yes, in which the woman is basically treated like an object, in which the woman is basically treated like a puppet, in which the man is supposed to be violent, in which the man is supposed to be aggressive. Yes. And this is something which people absolutely love. They thought, yes, absolutely, this is how men should be. Men should absolutely control women, and men should beat up women, and men should, own women, and men should be violent towards everybody, beat men, beat other women, beat other men, beat everybody. That, to a certain extent, is the kind of hegemonic masculinity that is prevalent in certain societies. Not all, but in certain societies, that is regarded as being hegemonic masculinity. But what about the second tier? What about complicit masculinity? Well, complicit masculinity is where the vast majority of us fall. The huge number of men fall within hegemonic masculinity. I'm sorry, within complicit masculinity. Now, what do these people do? People who come to belong to complicit masculinity, they are not hegemonic themselves, right? So they do not have the body of Salman Khan. They do not, go around behaving like Shahid Kapoor in Kabir Singh, but they support it. They support it. So they are constantly going to say, yes, that is what a man should be like. Yes. So therefore, think of the complicit masculine men as the policemen of hegemonic masculinity. They're policing all male bodies, and they're constantly telling men or boys how to be properly men, how to be properly women. So they're basically serving as the police of patriarchy. And they are constantly telling men that this is what you should do, this is what you shouldn't do, you should walk like this, you should talk like this. And that is where we have the invention of the term toxic masculinity, which is something that I am personally myself very amused by, because I think that if there is a toxic masculinity, then there has to be the non-toxic masculinity as well. And I just don't know what non-toxic masculinity is. I believe that all masculinities are equally toxic, as I believe that all femininities are equally toxic. I think gender is toxic. So therefore, let us not pick out masculinity to say, I have found toxic masculinity. But when you do that, you therefore assume that femininity isn't toxic at all, that it is something rather wonderful, which it isn't. And also you're therefore assuming that there is also non-toxic masculinity, which is very nice. So then you're going to say, so if I ask somebody, if you're saying that this is toxic masculinity, what is non-toxic masculinity? They're going to say, men who are gentle, men who are understanding, men who are non-violent, but they're all men. So then I ask them, if they're all, you seem to be assuming that those bodies that have a penis, they somehow automatically embody masculinity. On what are you basing that assumption? How are you assuming, again, how are you assuming that the body that has a penis will automatically perform masculinity, whether it be toxic or whether it be non-toxic? How do you assume that what they're performing is masculinity at all? right? So therefore, even when people are supposedly coining these very acceptable and very wonderfully critical terms such as toxic masculinity, they are still missing out on the basic problem, which is that masculinity, like femininity, is always toxic as long as it is prescriptive. As long as it is prescriptive. So if you are going to tell people this is the way in which you should behave in order to be a non-toxic man, that is also a kind of prescription of gender in some ways. And surely the whole point of gender studies, which is why gender studies becomes sort of, a study of a death wish, that the whole point of gender study is the annihilation of gender, that there should not be any gender to begin with. So there is a way in which we have begun to talk about masculinity by somehow not critiquing the very root of the problem, which is why construct gender at all, and why construct gender on the basis of genitalia at all. We don't address those questions. We simply assume that the person with the penis will automatically be male, and on that basis, we build a huge structure of assumptions. Okay, so you have complicit masculinity, and then we come to the third part, which is subordinate masculinity. Now, what does subordinate masculinity do? Subordinate masculinity belongs to those people who refuse to give in to the pressure of being hegemonic. So those who embody subordinate masculinity are those who are saying that I am not going to be the man that TV or Bollywood or music videos are wanting me to be. I will not be that kind of man. I am not going to be the kind of man who thinks that it is great to sexually harass women, right? Now, so therefore, but there's a very, very small number of men who actually resist that kind of pressure to conform to a certain hegemonic masculinity, very small. The vast majority of cis men, that is to say men who were assigned, bodies who were assigned male at birth, they, in most cases, rather happily subscribe to hegemonic masculinity. Whether they embody it in themselves or not, that is what they broadly subscribe to. And that is where it becomes really, really difficult, because when they are subscribing to a certain kind of masculinity, they regard that kind of masculinity as empowering. So they say, oh, I am powerful because I am a man. What they do not understand is that when they are conforming to a certain masculine stereotype, they are not being powerful, but they're actually being powerless. They're being powerless because what they're basically saying is, yes, sir, patriarchy, I obey you. Yes, sir, patriarchy, I totally agree that you are God. Is that being powerful? Total obedience, total subservience. Is that power? So therefore, when somebody says that I am going to smoke and I'm going to drink and I'm going to do drugs and I'm going to ride a motorcycle without a helmet and I am going to, currently, for example, there are some men who are saying, I'm not going to wear the mask. Right? I'm not going to wear the mask. The American president is a wonderful example of a man who says, I'm not going to wear the mask. Yes? Now, when Donald Trump refuses to wear the mask, why do you think he's doing that? He's doing that because he believes that if he wears the mask, somehow his masculinity is going to be in danger. So he refuses to wear the mask. And now, 4 months later, guess what? He is wearing the mask. So I remember many years ago when there were a series of motorcycle accidents in Kolkata, not many years ago, just a couple of years ago. And there were a series of motorcycle accidents in Kolkata, and the police, Kolkata police, had made it mandatory for motorcycle riders to wear the helmet. And I was walking down the road one day, and I was passing a petrol pump, and there were some local boys who were standing outside the petrol pump, and somebody drove his motorbike into the petrol pump to get his motorbike refilled, and this person who was driving the motorbike was already known to the people who were standing outside. And this person who was riding the motorbike, he was wearing a helmet. But what was interesting to me that day, and I will never forget it, is that those men who were standing beside the petrol pump, they called out to the man on the motorcycle and they said in Bengali, they said, "Bhai, tu your helmet polli." Yes. So for those of us who don't understand Bengali, what they were basically saying is, dude, you two are wearing a helmet, right? So the implication is that now that you've worn a helmet, you no longer are a true man, because true men don't protect their head. True men don't protect their bodies. True men are not scared to meet with an accident and die of a broken skull. So what I tell people is, if you want to be a true man, this is what you have to do. You have to drink, you have to smoke, you have to be abusive, not only to others, but you also have to be abusive to yourself. You have to disregard your body, you have to ride a motorcycle without a helmet, you have to crack a skull, and you have to die. Then you will achieve true masculinity. Dead. So this is really the way in which society valorizes a kind of masculinity, which is abusive to the person concerned, but it is also abusive to the other person. And this is where we also come into the way in which gender functions, because masculinity functions, or it is created in contradistinction to femininity. And as to what is feminine and what is masculine, they constantly change. There is no fixity about it, no fixity at all. The way in which femininity is defined in the northeast of India is not going to be the kind of femininity that will be accepted in the northern part of India. Yeah. So what is femininity in Mizoram or in Manipur is not going to be the femininity of Haryana. Similarly for masculinity. So therefore, there is a way in which masculinity and femininity, they are constantly produced as being complementary to each other, which is equally nonsensical, because there is no complementarity at all. Because very often I ask people, how do you define a true man? And they say, oh, a true man is somebody who's brave, somebody who's very courageous, and they refer to the Latin word vir. Yeah, so therefore vir, so therefore virtu, so therefore virtuous, brave, courageous. And I say, so therefore all the brave, courageous women in the world today, are they all men? Is that what you're saying? They say, no, there are some brave women. So I said, no, but you're saying that only brave men are true men, right? So therefore, so bravery is what defines masculinity. So if a woman is brave, she becomes masculine too. Yes, like that horrible film, Mardani. So there is a way in which society constantly produces the masculine in contradistinction to feminine. And this is something which also becomes a very important part of the way in which we perform or understand or recognize our sexual lives, the way in which we experience sex. Not sex as in sex assigned at birth, but sex as an act, the erotic, the libidinous. And that is also where we have this tremendous gendering of sex that happens. So if we look at homosexuality, right? So therefore, there is still a kind of an assumption among a lot of people that if you are gay, you are not quite a man. So the assumption seems to be that your gender is constructed by your sexuality. So only a heterosexual man can be a true man. Only a heterosexual woman can be a true woman. And as a result of that, what happens is that a lot of men who are gay are terrified of coming out, terrified of sort of declaring their sexuality. There may be many other reasons which I completely acknowledge and respect. But the widespread homophobia that is still there in the country is primarily because we still tie gender to sexuality, and there is no relationship between the two. There is no relationship between gender and sexuality. You can be gender presenting as a hegemonic man. That is to say, you can still be riding a motorcycle without a helmet, and you could be smoking and drinking and cursing, and you could still be gay. Or you could be a very gentle person who does not like riding a motorbike, who does not smoke, who does not drink, who speaks with a very soft voice, and still be straight. So there is no relationship at all between gender and sexuality, right? But what patriarchy does is that it constantly ties sexuality with gender and then gender to sex. And this is where patriarchy feeds us the story in reverse order. What patriarchy should tell us is that when we designate a child as being male or female, in our heads, we are thinking that the child is going to grow up to be heterosexual. It is the heterosexuality that is actually retroactively constructing gender and therefore retroactively constructing sex, right? So this is something which we really need to understand, that there is no relationship between gender and sexuality. And this is something that I think I am coming to the end of my talk. We are 49 minutes into the lecture, so I'm going to round up very quickly and start taking questions if possible. But what I will very quickly say is that we now must confront identities. We must now acknowledge identities. We must now understand. We must now respect identities that do not conform to our understanding of what masculinity is. We should be able to accept and we should be able to celebrate men with a vagina, just as we should be able to celebrate men without the penis. Yes. And we should also be able to celebrate women without the vagina and women without the penis. So I'm finally going to round up by saying that masculinity is fiction, just as femininity is fiction. These are all stories that we are fed. You can enjoy the stories, you can perform the stories in your own way, but please don't make the mistake of thinking that there is anything biological there. There is nothing biological. Everything is social. Everything is patriarchal. Thank you very much.
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yes.
Sir, fantastic session it was. We were actually spellbound listening to you, sir.
Thank you.
And I must take the privilege to declare that this is just 190th seminar or conference presentation by sir. So it was fantastic
Yes,
all the time
I have
listening to
just attended
you.
my 190th seminar. Yes.
Yes. So, and you have covered all the things, starting very well with Judith Butler, R.W. Connell, and presenting us with your day-to-day experience, even Trump to put on a mask or not, and helmet episode. Okay, so it was very nice, sir. You brought to us the matters of gravity in a very manner of levity. Thank you, sir. Now, I would like to, if you want, sir, we would like to take up some questions.
Yes,
Mm,
yes, of course, of course,
uh,
of course. I think
uh,
there is already a question from Professor Pandey. Is the portrayal of men as macho in advertisements not an attempt to create hegemonic masculine identity? Yes, it is. Professor Pandey, thank you so much for your question. It isn't so much an attempt to create a hegemonic masculine identity, but to constantly recirculate it, to constantly reinforce it. So it is not as though the hegemonic masculine is being created, but there is a certain kind of hegemonic masculinity that is already available. What advertisements do is that they recirculate it, they keep it current. And sorry, so it is this job that advertisements do. But Professor Pandey, I also believe that even the advertising agencies have become very feminist. So now you have a lot of advertising agencies that are now beginning to very slowly change the way in which masculinity is being portrayed. So now you have advertisements where men are shown to be cooking, men are shown to be doing washing, jobs that were supposedly feminine, men have been shown to be doing that. So the advertisements have started becoming a little bit more gender sensitive, little bit more feminist, and there are now diverse representations of masculinity, but the vast majority of those representations are certainly hegemonic. So your point is very well taken.
okay, sir. Thank you, sir. And okay, our admins are helpful. So, okay, Dr. Gopal Prasad Sinha. Sir, may I read out? Read it. Okay.
Yes, please. Yes.
Obsession with masculinity has been the cornerstone of Indian culture. How can we correlate this theory with modern finding of gender studies?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I think obsession with masculinity and femininity. It isn't just masculinity. I think gender has been, Indian culture, like many other cultures, have been obsessed with gender per se for a very long time. So it isn't just masculinity, femininity too. But since this lecture is on masculinity, it is very much the cornerstone of Indian culture. But also, we are perhaps not looking at Indian culture um, in in as much detail as we should, because if we did, then we would understand that even within Indian culture, there is a lot of variety in representations of masculinity. Yes. So in Indian culture, we also have the figure of Vishnu, who very often changes his sex and becomes Mohini. Yeah, so therefore there are ways in which we also have the figure of Ardhanarishwar. So and of course, when you're talking about Indian culture, we must also recognize that there are Islamic cultures. There are also Christian cultures that are also a part of Indian culture, where there is a lot of gender fluidity that is there. So it isn't just about masculinity. How can we correlate this theory with modern finding of gender studies? Very simply, what we really need to understand is that what is gender studies doing. Gender studies is saying that gender is a socio-cultural construct. So if we think of gender as a socio-cultural construct, then we can use that knowledge to look at the way in which masculinity was constructed in Indian culture down the centuries, and then we can see how our construction of masculinity has metamorphosed, it has changed, it has evolved. Yeah, so therefore in Bengal, for example, where I am right now, in the 1970s, our ideal of masculinity was Uttam Kumar, who never fought, who never cursed, who was a gentle person, who sang beautiful songs, who sat under trees, who read books. And now we have Dev, who's fighting all the time, right? So therefore, so this huge sort of transition of masculinity from Uttam Kumar to Dev is a very clear example of the way in which masculinity constantly changes in Indian culture, and I think masculinity studies will help us analyze that better. So thank you so much, Dr. Sinha, for your question.
Thank you, sir. Okay, we have next question from Amita
Yes.
Mandal. The claustrophobic and suppressed condition of Jairaj in dance, like a man because of violating the stereotypical norms of masculinity. How this condition can be interpreted using masculinity theory?
Oh, it can be interpreted very, very well. It can be interpreted very, very productively, because what you really have to understand is exactly why is Jairaj suffering. Now, Jairaj is suffering because he is surrounded by these stereotypes of masculinity. And so therefore, Jairaj's masculinity, if you use the theorization of Connell, oh, by the way, I have mentioned Western theorists of masculinity, but I should also mention a lot of Indian sort of academicians who have also started to contribute to masculinity studies. So, Amita, I would certainly recommend that you take a look at the work of people like Sanjay Srivastava. You take a look at the work of people like Mangesh Kulkarni. You take a look at the work of people like Rahul Roy. These are the people who are also contributing to a very large extent to masculinity studies in India. So, to come to Mahesh Dattani's play, I think you can certainly use masculinity studies to see that is Jairaj therefore embodying a subordinate masculinity? This is up to you to see. If Jairaj is he suffering because he refuses to be hegemonic? And also, is Jairaj entirely non-hegemonic? Does Jairaj never have any power? Does Jairaj never have any agency? What is the relationship between Jairaj and his wife, for example? So therefore, there are all of these questions, very interesting questions, and you can totally use masculinity studies to read Jairaj in a very productive way. So thank you, Amita, for your question.
Okay, thank you, sir. Shamikha Das, okay, she has a question. Are not everybody trying to put everything in binaries, like good and bad, day and night, male and female, man and women? How to break such binaries as it has been constructed over a period of time?
Yeah, well, my entire talk was about destroying those binaries. Is to basically say that if you look at the man, woman, male, female binary particularly, this was the whole point of the talk, Shomikha, is that when we designate somebody as a man, when we designate somebody as a woman, we are most often doing it primarily on the basis of the genitalia that they're born with, and also on the basis of the gender presentation. So there are so many ways in which you can break the binaries, and that is to so there are many ways of doing that. But remember that today we have queer theory, which also tells you that gender is a spectrum, that there is no one male, there is no one female, that we are all somewhere in the middle. We are all somewhere in the middle. Nobody is 100% male, nobody is 100% female. We are all somewhere in the middle. So if you're all somewhere in the middle, the whole binarization of gender is a completely failed project. It doesn't work anymore. It never did, it doesn't anymore. The ways in which we can certainly resist it is by understanding ourselves as not being gendered. That is something that we can do. So we can certainly say, when somebody asks you, so Shomikha, I'm assuming that you are gender assigned female at birth. If you are a gender assigned female at birth, then the next time you say something or do something and people tell you, oh, a woman should not behave like this, or a woman should not speak like this, you should then counter the person by saying, what makes you think I'm a woman? Who told you that I'm a woman? They're going to say, no, because you look like a woman. What does a woman look like? So then if you counter these attempts at assigning gender to you, then I think it is going to become very difficult for people to binarize you anymore. So resist the labels that have been put upon you without your consent.
Fantastical answer. Okay, Benazir Rifaya, she has a question. Dear Shah,
Yes.
what are the most crucial elements to healthy masculinity, and how do we promote them? Or do we not need to promote healthy masculinity? Okay. Uh,
Benazir, Benazir.
mm,
I don't know what healthy masculinity is because I don't know what is masculinity. All that I have been saying all along is that masculinity is simply a form of gender presentation. That's all that it is. It is a form of gender presentation. But of course, gender presentation can sometimes be healthy, can sometimes be unhealthy. So therefore, a healthy presentation of gender, irrespective of masculinity or femininity, right? So a gender presentation that is healthy is a gender presentation that is not um, normative, right? So if you choose to dress in a certain way, or if you choose to speak or walk in a certain way, you are entirely within your rights to do that, but you should not become prescriptive. So then you should not go around telling people, why are you dressed like this, why are you talking like that, why are you wearing that color, why are you walking like that. So the way in which we can produce a proliferation of genders, because again, like I say, gender doesn't exist, gender is just style, right? So if gender doesn't exist, then we can have a proliferation of styles, and there should be no prescription. People should not be told, if you are a man, you have to behave like this. If you're a woman, you have to behave like this. Any kind of prescription becomes patriarchal, and we should try to avoid that.
okay, thank you, sir. Uh, Rajashri Goswami. She has a question. If there is no interpretation of gender, how dangerous will be the world for us?
Rajasri. Again, I'm assuming that you are, gender assigned female at birth. So if you are a gender assigned female at birth, Rajasri, ask yourself this very simple question, and I'll tell you how dangerous it is going to be. Think of the number of times you wanted to do something, but you couldn't do it because people told you you cannot do it because you're a woman. Think about the number of times men wanted to do something and men were not allowed to do it because they were told, you cannot do it, you're a man. So, Rajasri, this is how dangerous the world is going to be without gender. There will be the peace and freedom to live the way you want to live, to dress the way you want to dress, the way, to talk the way you want to talk, to walk the way you want to walk, to live in peace and harmony with yourself, Rajasri. That is how dangerous it is going to be. Does it sound very dangerous to you?
So, thank you, sir, for such answer. Prabha and Mary. Okay, she has the question. Sir, do you think pseudo masculinity still has its stronghold even in developed countries, or the responsibility is lacking in the popular notion of masculinity?
Wow. Well, when you say pseudo masculinity, you assume that there is a true masculinity. So there is a real masculinity, there is a pseudo masculinity. This is my news to you, Prabha and Mary. There is no real masculinity. I'm so sorry. All masculinity is pseudo all femininity is pseudo, it is all false, it is all presentation. It is all presentation. It is the way in which we like to present ourselves. We are all actors. We are all actors. So, therefore, there is no such thing as pseudo masculinity because there is no such thing as true masculinity. So that I think is something that I need to clarify. Or the responsibility is lacking in the popular notion of masculinity. No, I think the popular notion of masculinity is very responsible, unfortunately, because you are going to have the fathers and the brothers, right? Who are going to be very responsible. They are going to say, I am a man and I will, I am responsible for the household. So I'm going to tell you, you should come back home by 6. I am responsible. So I will choose the person you are going to get married to. I am responsible. So I will decide which college or university you're going to go to. Lot of responsibility. But what you really have to understand is that what they claim to be responsibility is not responsibility at all. It is simply control. Controlling is not about responsibility. So I think that is where we really need to stop the way in which masculinity is performed today. Thank you, Prabha. I think we can take one last question.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Pradeep Dhillon, here is the question, sir. Do you agree that the term identity should be replaced with subjectivity because it is how an individual asserts itself rather than the external markers who define it?
Correct. Oh, wow. Yes, the last question is also very, very interesting. Thank you, Pardeep Dillon, for your wonderful question. Yes, yes. You can certainly stop talking about identity, but you can talk about subjectivity. But I am simply going to leave you with this one thought, that what you think of as subjectivity, something that you are in yourself, how much of that which you think of yourself is actually yourself? How much of that is not, in fact, the way in which you draw from the language, from the cultures, from the history that is available to you to construct who you are? So, therefore, it is all very well for us to claim subjectivity for ourselves, but we should also understand that what we understand as subjectivity is also constructed by us out of things that are available to us outside us. But thank you, Pardeep, for your wonderful question.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. This part was so nice, actually. Your explanation, your elucidation, and your articulation, simply superb, sir. Now, we would like to move forward to the vote of thanks session. For this session, I would like to invite Rimpi ma'am, faculty of Munger University. Please, ma'am, if you okay, she has come up. Okay, please,
Okay,
ma'am, propose and extend vote of thanks. Okay.
Thank you very much, sir, for inviting me to deliver the vote of thanks. Thank you, sir. Again, on behalf of the organizers of this 3-day National Web Conference on Contemporary Trends in Literature, I take this opportunity to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Ranjit Kumar Verma, Pro-Vice Chancellor, Professor Kusum Kumari, Revered Registrar, Colonel Vijay Kumar Thakur, esteemed convener, Dr. Bhavish Chandra Pandey, all the teachers of the English Department of Munger University, today's session moderator, Mr. Atanu Paul, and especially Mr. Abhishek Kumar for his technical assistance and help. I am even more thankful to the renowned speaker of this session, Professor Niladri Chatterjee, for his mesmerizing lecture on masculinity studies. In spite of being independent of each other, our sexed bodies are supposed to conform to accepted notions of gender to escape outright mass ridicule. So, Sir has beautifully pointed out how this hypothesis has been scrutinized and repudiated by the leading literary theorist of the 90s, Judith Butler, in her pioneering books, where she opines that even sexuality is performative, thus deconstructing the conception that biology is immutable. Thank you very much, sir, again for acquainting us with such trailblazing theories. And finally, I will express my gratitude to all the attendees because they have been with us throughout, and without their support and involvement, this conference would have turned absolutely meaningless. Thank you very much for sparing your valuable time and remaining with us. And we hope to organize such webinars in near future only because of you. Thank you very much. So that's it. Have a very nice day. Over to Mr. Atanu.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. And I would like to use this very platform to announce that we are again meeting at 3 p.m. today only for the final session. So please be there. This is the declaration to the audience out there. And sir, this was so nice listening to you. It was so mesmerizing. Okay, we are immediately transported to that classroom vibes, classroom atmosphere, and we look forward to be transported again and again. Okay, thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Thank
sir,
you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, admins, please, Somo sir. Okay.